I went to Sheffield University. I did history at A-level at school, and it was really interesting because we were kind of racing through from, what was that, Henry VII through to James II or something.
Mm-hmm.
And we left out the English Civil War and the Republic, and because it was too difficult and too complex to compress within a 2-year syllabus. And so it had always intrigued me, the area where I lived, the pub that I used to drink at was built around the Civil War time. It goes back that far, and supposedly some cavalier hid in the fireplace there. So it was always an episode that really fascinated me, the fact that England had had a civil war and a revolution that essentially opened the door to France having its revolution. And so I chose Sheffield University because they kind of specialized in that period and had courses specifically on the Civil War and the Republic and Oliver Cromwell. So I know it sounds so detached, but I think that to me, I mean, it sounds like you've taken this circuitous route too, from being a surgeon to an art dealer, and people think, what? You know, to me, I'm just someone that's very interested in how things fit together and why they are the way they are, whether that's the parliamentary system in England or whether that's how an aspen tree grows. To me, there's still a similarity there in figuring out how things work, how they're put together, and why things are the way they are.
It's called curious human being. That's what it is.
Right. Right.
It is. That's exactly what it is. People who are curious, you know, evaluate and look at those, you know, those elements that, you know, may be very disparate in their ways, but if they see commonality, right? I'm sure all your paintings have that same sensibility. If you really go to look at them, you know, it's just not a landscape of the Grand Canyon or Utah or something like that. There's other things for sure. And your titles tell you a lot as well. I think the titles are an insight into the soul of the painting to some extent.
Yeah. I mean, I think as a painter, for me, it's almost a means to an end. You know, you're drawing or you're painting something in order to understand it better. Whether it's a human figure or whether it's a tree or whether it's how a canyon works or, you know, the mesa or volcanic uplifts and so forth. And to me, painting is a side product of trying to understand that environment and that landscape and how it's all put together, you know. And as much of a kind of prude and cantankerous man John Ruskin was, I mean, he was very much an advocate of getting everybody to draw, even if they weren't talented or they didn't intend to be painters, and just in order to understand something a lot deeper.
That's right. It's the same in medicine, right? So, I mean, you could learn medicine without going to medical school, but you'll never get the deep level of, on a cellular level, on pathological and anatomy level. And so all those little processes that you go through help you when you get to the final end. If you're trying to make a diagnosis, you go, oh, I know the pathology, I understand the anatomy, I understand what's going on here. And I think that's the same as an artist. Drawing, which is seems to be somewhat of a lost art form, really is the basic structure of, you know, understanding composition.
Right. At least it
and
painting is a way of understanding a landscape. There is just there's no better way of getting to know a place than to sit still, to be still, and to try and render some of that on a 2D surface.
Yes, I would think that. Of course, I'm not a painter, so I've just said all this stuff, and you know, I live through painter's eyes and kind of understand.
I don't go out to. When I say the painting is a side product, when I go outside to paint or to draw whatever, you know, materials I have with me, I don't go out with a view to I am producing a product, i.e. a painting.
Right.
I go out with the real mindset of I want to learn about this place. And if a painting pops out as a side product of that process of observation and conversation with a place, then that's great.
Well, that's the same for me in the sense that I don't look at selling a product. I hate that term, in fact, but I look at the moment it took to take that painting.
Yeah.
And when I look at a piece, I mean, really look at a piece, not just, and hopefully all dealers do this that really care, is they spend the time, just like you spent the time in front of that area where you painted plein air. I take the time to look at the painting alone and get the sense of what's going on and how you did the colors and the shadowing and why the thing pops for me emotionally as well. And I think it's very important, like the painting we're talking about behind you, that painting popped for me when I saw it just on your Facebook site or Instagram, whichever it was, I don't remember, and immediately hit a chord. And I've sat in front of that painting on more than one occasion, just enjoying it, just as you sat in front of that area when you first did it. So there is a thread, I think, and it's palpable if you're a serious artist that's trying to make an emotional statement.
Right. It's important to me that they feel very personal. And I think if you're doing it right, there's no way that they can't feel personal, and that there's kind of an authenticity there.
Yeah.
That comes with that. Personal.
Yeah, every one of your paintings, I haven't represented you that long yet, but it will be. We're going to, 20 years from now, we'll have this conversation. But even in the short couple of years that I've represented you, I feel each painting is very unique. There's something, there's the way you do some of the things that you do in the foreground, which are kind of ephemeral. I can feel that it's different. There's emotion in that painting. And then we're talking about landscape paintings too, which is, when you can bring that to the land, it's a magical thing. And the fact that I'm from the West, I can feel the West in your paintings, I think. And maybe you want to just tell me, because to me, I've always felt for somebody to really paint a subject, they have to be in that area, that they can't just do it from photos. They can't just do it from videos or whatever. They have to be there smelling, looking, seeing, tasting, touching, experiencing that light, color, form, and all that. What do you think?
It's interesting because, what you're touching upon hits home for me, because I made my name in the United States doing a lot of the plein air events and competitions.
Right.
And it was great because I got to meet friends and other artists and make connections in a new country, which was really vital to me. But the reason I stopped doing them was I pretty much had a panic attack getting out the plane in Baltimore and driving out to Easton, and I didn't know the trees. They were like these huge things, and I panicked because I didn't know what type of trees they were. And as a result, I felt like a total fraud. Like, how can I come here for a week and be painting this landscape and not know what I'm looking at? And it was one of those things that actually stopped me from doing those competitions and just, feeling like a member of a SWAT team, getting out of an airplane with my easel and going to grab at least 20 paintings in 5 days. And then I just felt like I started to feel like a fraud. I started to feel like I wanted to put down roots and paint what I know. And at that point, I was based in Austin, Texas, and I just didn't do the heat well. And so we got a little 2-room miner's cabin here in Rico, and that was my go-to place. And as soon as it got above 90 degrees, I would take the 2 dogs and run for the hills. And I think I just wanted to be here more and more. And maybe it's because it's forested and green and we get rain, and it feels a little like Scotland, where I was really happy that it really kind of resonates. And then from here, I don't know why an English girl feels such an affinity for the desert, but I do. And
I can tell you.
You can tell that. I think,
I can tell you why. Because there's something in there that clicks,
Yeah.
And I think everybody has it. I think artists are more in touch with that sensual side, that creative side. And when they feel that click, that, that puzzle coming together, that, you're home. I feel it when I go to Hawaii. I don't know why. When I'm on the Big Island, I feel like I'm there, right? It's meant to be. Same with New Mexico, same with Arizona. There's certain places. And for whatever that thing was, it was always there, and it was just a puzzle waiting to be filled. And you were lucky enough to find it. And you probably knew it instantaneously, I have a funny feeling.
And I think, where Rico is, it's ideal because I can be in Canyonlands in 3.5 hours. If I drive, even though we're at 9,000 feet in aspen and spruce forest, if I drive an hour south, I'm in sagebrush country. And so I'm really near the desert. I don't want to live in 100 degrees anymore, but I definitely want to access the desert.
Interestingly, there seems to be a connection between the New York art world and the New Mexico art world. Stiglitz, O'Keeffe, people going back and forth.
Yeah, Marston Hartley, John Marin, all these guys came and spent time. John Sloan, Maynard Dixon came, Dorothea Lange. It was through Mabel Lujan Dodge, she brought all these, wonderful people that were artists and literature, and there was an exposure there, no doubt. And some of the best works, in my opinion, by Hartley and Hinrye were both done in that 1917, 1918 time frame. Different cultures, and it's different. It's definitely a different feel when you're around Native American cultures, Hispanic cultures, and Anglo cultures all mixed in. That's actually a great thing, and it's very creative. And that's one of the reasons we come here every year too. We're doing this podcast from Santa Fe today.
Correct. Earlier I mentioned that I studied with Marshall McLuhan.
Yeah.
And Marshall would always preface everything by saying, in the coming electronic age, well, of course, we have the electronic age now. And he maintained that it would re-tribalize our culture, and in that we would change our perception of things. Marshall called media the extensions of man. So I take the subway to work every day, and virtually everyone has their handheld device in front of them. Nobody reads the newspaper anymore, that they check their handheld devices. And I think that that's altered the way we perceive art and perceive everything. Dr. McLuhan would talk about baseball as a literary game, in the sense that you have fixed positions and you hit the ball and you go from one base to the next base to the next base. And he felt that that game was representative of time past, and that in the coming electronic age, a game such as soccer, where everybody is everywhere and it's all mixed up at the same time, would become more popular. Now, Mark, you and I remember that when I was a kid, there was no such thing as soccer.
No, we didn't have any.
And now, of course, all the kids play soccer, and only a few play baseball.
Partially, that could also be a worldwide phenomenon, too.
Right.
And again, he's right. I mean, it's media exposed because we see World Cup, right? We're all going watching World Cup. Right. And so we have an interest, and our children learn early on. And maybe you could tell us just a little bit about him, because not everybody may not know.
Well, Dr. McLuhan wrote a book called Understanding Media. He wrote many books, and his work really revolutionized the way people thought about media. And I believe he's considered the patron saint of Wired magazine. And in 1964, he said that, he wrote in Understanding Media, that in the coming electronic age, the industrial worker will be on a par with the savant. And of course, that's a puzzling thing. What does he mean by that? But of course, what he meant was Google. And you want to know what all the where the trains are going to come in, or what the schedule is.
Or how to get to this place?
Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah. Anybody can do it now.
Yeah.
Where all that knowledge was very specific and required research. So part of this retribalization of culture, I think, has shifted the way that we look at things. When we talk about geometries, abstract art, now it's contemporary art, but we see it previously already prefigured in indigenous art. And of course, modern art, Picasso went to Africa to see that. So it's all very interesting. And now we have somebody like President Macron in France saying that maybe all the art in the French museums should go back to to Africa, and there's talk about the Elgin marbles going back to Greece, and of course there's some talk about some of the Native American art going back to Native American communities. I don't completely understand why people think that way now. It probably also has to do with electronic media. I think it's a puzzling thing because it calls into question the whole idea of Western museums and basically secular humanism. Do we all have a shared human aesthetic, which I think we do, and I don't think it's limited to different ethnicities. I don't know if you have any comments on that.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's an ever-evolving situation. I mean, as antique dealers in Native American art, I think there are certain parameters that we have to respect, things that are spiritual, things that are important to the individuals from a ceremonial point. Those are things that should remain, in my opinion, with the tribes. The question is, you have to have some way to delineate what those are and what aren't, and that probably to some extent needs to come from the Native Americans to give us some guidance on that. But at the same time, most of the things that we handle, I would say almost exclusively, really are tourist based into some, or trade items.
We're approaching 100 years of Santa Fe Indian Market.
Yeah.
I would like to mention that ATADA, the
right now, John
dealers,
is the president of ATADA, which is the Antique Tribal Dealers Association.
We are sponsoring a program called the Voluntary Return Program.
Yeah, tell us about that.
And we have returned over 100 objects to the Pueblos that they felt or they feel are community property and should never have been sold. So over the course of the 20th century, many objects were sold by people who were caretakers, but they were actually the property belonged to the community and they didn't have a right to sell them. And that's the current view. And so we have this voluntary return program where, as I mentioned, we returned over 100 objects to different pueblos.
Right, and the majority of the things that we would consider objects that we would handle, in fact, I would say all the things that we consider that we handle really for ATADA members is things that were more trade items or sold, literally made to be sold.
Well, every ATADA member agrees not to sell things that are culturally sensitive to Native American communities.
That's it. I mean, that really is the bottom line. If it's culturally sensitive, we're not going to be involved in it.
Correct.
And nor should we. And I kind of made that my standard as soon as I started handling material at all, that I just didn't want to be involved in that kind of stuff. And it's an evolving area because it's, what is sensitive and what isn't is always, I think it evolves, and that's okay. And you need to have that dialogue. But one of the ways to have that dialogue is through ATADA, I think.
Well, ATADA is definitely taking a leadership position in this conversation, correct?
Yeah, and where would you like to see that go in the future?
Well, I think that we should continue to return objects that are in the communities that were disenfranchised from the Native American community, often by the government. If you recall, the government used to take children from their homes.
My book that I just wrote, the Charles Bloom book, is based on that. It's called Indian School Days. The whole thing is based on that.
So, and then of course, in certain parts of the country, the Indian religions were outlawed. And, it goes way back to the Spanish, where if you were converted or you were killed.
Yeah.
And so it's not that bad these days, and we're trying to correct some of those incorrect behaviors. And we have a art market that is very separate from that, so people should realize that these are two different things. And if you want to buy objects that are sacred to Native American communities, you can't on an ATADA-sponsored event.
So it was funny. First show at the gallery, we all had our stuff there. And Phil Curtis, who's a well-known painter from Phoenix, came in and I was introduced to him and he said, "What's your paintings?" And I said, "Oh, those two up there, And he goes, looks at him, he goes, "I know what your problem is. you can do too many things well. And he left, and I went, what does he mean?
Yeah.
But I think he meant that I was a technician, which I kind of was. I just doing kind of soft focus photorealism
Yeah.
and stuff. So it took me a while to figure out what he meant, but it was an important thing for him to say. And so then so that gallery closed, and then there was one called Elizabeth Burns Gallery,
Mm-hmm.
and she was open for a couple of years, and then Marilyn Butler bought it. It was a very small gallery, and it handled Fritz Scholder and a guy named Earl Linderman, who were, both
Yep.
major hot guys right then.
Yep.
So I was kind of stuck in the back room a lot, So,
They must have had good taste though, because she had Fritz Scholder.
oh, she did, yeah, But people was going, oh, when I've seen Ed Mell, they drag something out of the back room, So I thought, well, it's time to move on.
Yeah.
So I actually made a few appointments with Elaine Horwich, but
Right.
she never showed up or called me. So, she was in Santa Fe. It was in the summer, and I understand. And in the meantime, Suzanne Brown got word that I was looking, and I thought I was keeping it a big secret. But,
And they used to work together, I think, right? Brown and Elaine Horowitz.
They had something called the Art Wagon in the early days.
Yeah. So at this point, they're kind of competitors, right?
They were.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so I said to Suzanne, your contract, I can't sign a contract like that. She said, you don't need to sign a contract. And she said, I'll give you a show whenever you want. So I had, I put together a show almost when I would have had one across the street. And it was I was starting to really hit my stride more, and it really did well. And
What year would this have been?
oh, I joined her in 81.
81. So because you had a show in like Amarillo, was it, or Lubbock?
I did have one in Amarillo.
It was Amarillo in 1980, right?
Yeah, you're right.
And that was one of your very first, maybe your first major kind of
Yeah,
show?
and that was in a guy's house.
Yeah, but you did very well, right?
Yeah, well, for those times, I came home with some money.
Yeah, because I ended up with a couple of those paintings from people out of that.
Oh, did you?
I
really?
have, yeah, uh-huh.
Interesting.
And they were great. They were great paintings.
Yeah, it was a learning experience. I can't remember well, my friend, when a mic's in front of me, I can't think.
Yeah, no. I can't think when the mic is or isn't in front of me sometimes. But one of your good friends had set it up.
David Notter's wife, she is from Amarillo, and she set this whole thing up. So we go there, and there's this big, beautiful home, kind of Santa Fe style. And the guy that owned it became a senator in Texas. And again, it escapes me. But
Right.
So we went in to hang my show in their house. And I had to take down a Picasso and a Cézanne, the real deal.
Right.
And they hired a guard that stood by the closet that they were
The
in.
expensive stuff.
Yeah. But they had a big crowd of people, and people bought stuff, and it was wonderful. So.
And you did great stuff. I mean, there was some really, I know the two pieces I got out of that that have been in that show were wonderful.
Yeah.
I mean, they were,
Do you still have them?
no.
Yeah. I'm curious what they were, because I hardly remember.
Yeah, I can show you. I actually know where one of them is, and it's in one of my good friends' collection, and I know the other one. Yeah, they were fantastic paintings. Yeah, very typical of that kind of time frame. I mean, more simple. Yeah. And I think you were using at that point the Ed Mell block kind of a signature. Do you remember when you quit using that?
Well, Marilyn Butler said you better develop a signature. So I thought that was a good idea, because it's a lot easier to sign than it is to hand letter.
Right, Ed Mell. Yeah. So that would have been, if she's doing that, that's like maybe 79. You started, because 80 they still had the Ed Mell. I think those things still had the early block.
It was probably right in there when I changed, because I was in Suzanne Brown in 81,
Yes.
and I was with her for 20 years.
Yes. So there's the tidbit of the Ed Mell aficionados out there. If it's the block letter Ed Mell signature, it's probably 1980 or before.
Yeah.
It's only a short period of time, really, maybe
Yeah.
3 years worth of art that has that.
Exactly.
So you end up with Suzanne. She says, "I'll do whatever. Just come with me. Don't go with."
And I had a good. Actually, Elaine Horwich was never mentioned in the conversation.
Yeah.
She just. I mean, she said, "I really want you," and I figured. Elaine Horwich was a hipper gallery.
Yeah.
And I wanted to be in that environment. But Suze Brown, there's something to be said for a gallery that really wants you.
Yes.
And they'll treat you right. And we did a lot of good business for 20 years.
Yeah. Yeah. When I started showing you in whatever it was, let's say 96, somewhere in that time frame, I'll have to actually look it up. And Suzanne Brown came down to meet me. Did you know that?
I didn't know that, and
Yeah.
I think you did tell me, but she didn't want me to be in another gallery in Arizona.
Yeah.
And I said, well, Howard Post is over down there.
Right, exactly.
If he can do it, I can do it. So I
Exactly.
just did it.
Yeah. Because Howard was in Suzanne Brown's as well.
Right. He paved the way for me.
Yeah, he did. Yeah, he did. And and so she came down, and I think she just wanted to size me up, first of all, to see if I would be too much competition.
Right.
Which makes sense, I guess. And two, probably just to make sure I was an okay guy, and just not going to screw up your world or her world.
Early career.
Yeah, exactly. Because a dealer can screw things up for people if they do things.
I've been very fortunate.
Yeah.
I've been very fortunate. So in 81, a Dewey Coffin Gallery approached me.
That's in Santa Fe.
Yeah, and Ray came over, and he was such a great guy.
He is a great guy.
Yeah, anyway. As soon as I talked to him, I knew I wanted it. And he had pictures of his new gallery on the plaza, and I said, "Oh yeah, I think I'm going to have to go with you." So we were together. It's evolved from Dewey Coffin to Dewey Galleries to Owens Dewey, and now I'm with Owens. So it's that involvement I've stayed with all this time.
Yeah, that's amazing. And they did at least one show. One of their first shows was like Ed Mell, Maynard Dixon kind of thing, right?
It was. That was right when Owens Dewey was happening. People were comparing my work to his, and I always felt that you deal with it straight on. Of course he influenced me, And so we did a catalog and everything that, for that show. And I thought it clears the air, so to speak.
Right.
It's not, he influenced me, but I think all artists are a continuum.
Yeah, of course.
There's not a guy on the planet that isn't influenced by somebody.
Yeah, well, you also like Long McGargy, you like Blumenschein, you like some of the early Mexican artists. I mean, those are all...
Yeah, a lot of the Taos founders.
Yeah. I mean, all those...
Victor Higgins.
Yeah, of course. I mean,
Andrew
I think...
Dasberg.
I think the comparison, why people see this Dixon-Mell comparison is that I think people say they both captured the West with truth, and when you look at those, you go, and not a lot of people do, and both of you guys really captured it with an essence of getting whatever that is, whether it's the shadows and the colors and the forms and the clouds. I mean, it used to be Dixon clouds, Dixon sunset. Now it's Mell sunset. I don't ever hear the word Dixon anymore. I only hear it's a Mell sunset. It's a Mell sunset.
Oh, he's not around. It didn't bother him.
I wonder if he heard that when he was alive. I bet he did.
Probably so. But, he was a different time. The populists weren't so aware of artists like they are now, because of the media and everything like that. So I had a cover of Southwest Art in 1981 or two.
Yeah, I own that painting.
Oh, yes, you
No,
do?
I don't. I own the one that's on the cover of Arizona Highways.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
That's right. And Don Haggerty saw the article, and who did the Dixon book.
Yes.
And was friends with Edith Hamlin, and gave me a call, and we became good friends. And of course, he wrote my book in '97, so he said. So I'd been hanging out with Jerry Foster, who was a helicopter pilot for Channel 12.
Yeah, that's a big component of what you do.
It really is. I mean, especially back then, and I've got so much reference that I once in a while go and see if there's anything I missed.
Right.
The thrill of those trips were amazing. I mean, Jerry was a spirited flyer, and we had some amazing trips.
Was he a combat guy? Do you know?
He taught. I think he taught military helicopter.
I see. Yeah. So he was this helicopter guy who you got an invitation to go up.
Right. I met Tom Gruzinski was a photographer, and we were mutual friend. How am I trying to say that? Anyway, Tom was a good friend of Jerry's. And so he brought Jerry over to my place once, and he saw what I was doing painting wise, and I casually dropped a hint. What a great perspective for an artist.
Boy, I'd like to see that someday.
So he called me up and he goes, "Okay, pack lightly, meet me on top of Channel 12 at 6 a.m. And we're packed for, I think, 4 days or something like that." So the first day in a helicopter, other than when I was living in New York, my ad agency was in the there again, it's an airline.
Yeah.
Pan Am.
Yeah.
It was a Pan Am building. So I'd go to work, I'd take my suitcase, I'd go up on the roof, catch a helicopter, and, I felt like a real modern guy.
Oh, yeah, you are. Hot shot, actually.
Anyway, so that's the only time I'd been in a helicopter, mind you. And this is a little Hughes 500D. It's a jet helicopter, very capable. They're really a sports car of helicopters back then, I think. And so I meet him and Tom and the cameraman, because they did these trips. They did video for little pieces and a half-hour piece on every trip. And so the first day we land on some rocks at Sedona, went clear to the top of San Francisco Peaks.
Yeah, which is like 13,000 feet or something.
It's 12,600.
Yeah.
The ceiling of a helicopter is about 13.
Yeah.
So later on, Jerry admitted getting it back up in the air was a little difficult.
Yeah, I'm sure.
And I remember we just kind of went up and
fell
died
off.
Down,
Oh God.
So, and then I remember we flew and we landed at 2 Gray Hills trading posts.
Yes.
And we walked in, and the owner goes, "I like the way you boys dropped in here." and then we went to the Grand Canyon when you could still fly in the canyon.
Right.
I mean, and we're treetop level, and all of a sudden it just opens up and you drop into the thing.
Wow.
It was. There was more than one time I thought I was going to die.
What ended up happening was I was so broke, even though I was working full time. I had asked Mom, and the Indian art business was booming here in New Mexico. So I asked Mom if she would send me a box of clay. I'm like, you know what? I grew up doing this. How hard can it be? So there I am teaching myself, right, how to make pottery. Working with Santa Clara clay, taught myself how to polish all over again. So, you shut the bathroom. If you want to keep, humidity, right? If you want to learn to polish evenly, as you're doing your polishing strokes, so it doesn't dry up on you, you turn the shower on, right? Close the toilet lid, and you're sitting there on the toilet with the shower running, right? Polishing your pottery.
Wow,
So,
this sounds like it's really a, anybody who wants to be a ceramist says it's a glory job. It's kind of like being an art dealer. I always say to people when I'm hanging a painting, struggling on a thing, yeah, it's great. It's such a great job.
yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh, this is so awesome. And so I'm like, you know what? Everybody knows my mother. I'm going to use my mother's name to get my foot in the door, and I'll keep going from there. So I call a dealer in Albuquerque, and I said, hi, I'm Susan. I'm Jody Folwell's daughter. Are you interested in some pottery? He said, sure. So I said I'd ship it to him, right? I'd send it, and I wrap it up, I put it in a box, I ship it to him, and I hear nothing, right? And I'm just waiting, and I'm waiting. I'm like, well, do I call him? What do I do? And like a month later, there is a box that comes to me.
Pottery coming back.
And I open it up, and there's a note attached to it that says, I can't even use these for door stops.
Oh my God. Do you want to say who that dealer was?
No, I don't. I don't.
Yeah. Wow. That's brutal. I mean, that's absolutely brutal to do that to somebody, quite frankly. What did you take from that? I mean, that's not.
You know what? It was absolutely perfect. All of that was the perfect storm. Being so broke, being on what felt like the other side of the planet. It really lit a fire under me.
I bet. Well, it either lights a fire or it extinguishes it.
Right.
That's
right.
The problem.
So, yeah, that was the other kind of catalyst of just, I was like, watch me. He's going to regret this. Watch me. So he eventually did.
Did he make his amends ever and say something? So
Never.
I was wrong. No.
Never.
What'd your mom say? What'd your mom say to that? Did you? I'm sure you called her and said, "My God, this is what this guy said."
Yeah, I can't remember what she said. I'm sure it was something comforting, as I'm weeping and crying over the phone, and
I'm sure
sniffling and snorking and whatnot. But I certainly had the conversation of, just send me more clay. And I did, and I learned to fire. I don't know how many pots I blew up in the backyard, right in the middle of the inner city, right? It's amazing. I didn't burn half of Kansas City down.
Yeah.
So, yet another sharp learning curve.
So you're making these pots. You're trying to become an artist at this point in a different field, which is your family tradition. Really, it's your family business in some respects. And so when you leave Kansas, how long did you stay there?
I was only there for a couple of years, and then I ended up moving back to Santa Clara, and I ended up. So it can get a little hazy because I've done a lot of moving around, and after that was a lot of moving around northern New Mexico. So staying or renting an apartment for, a year or two, and then moving to somewhere else and whatnot. But it was after that, once I ended up moving back home, and I taught myself how to make pottery. And part of that too, that experience in Kansas was the place that I worked, the people were actually fairly racist. They said some terrible, terrible, terrible things about their customers, and I could only imagine how they felt about me.
Right.
I think I was actually hired to meet some quota, honestly. And I worked there for exactly a year, and part of that was just saying, you know what, I'm never going to work for anyone ever again. That I'm going to work for me. I'm never going to do this ever again. It had put such a bad taste in my mouth. So that impetus with the note that's saying I can't use these for doorstops, it turned into kind of the perfect storm for me to, really light a fire under me and do it right.
And so when you come back to Santa Clara, you start making pottery. And then was there a point there fairly soon after that you did find outlets to sell your artwork, whether it's Indian Market or other galleries?
I did. I did a lot of hustling in the way that I'd go visit friends in Arizona, and literally I would open a phone book and, you know, look for Indian art, anything Indian art, and just make phone calls, you know, just keep calling. I did the same thing in Albuquerque and Santa Fe. I'd make trips to Colorado and do the same thing, you know, kind of hold up somewhere and then open a phone book, right?
Yeah.
And then just start calling people. So, yes, eventually I got myself into a number of doors. And then slowly, once I started to have a bit of a name, once I was making money, I was able to scale back a bit and just start focusing on, you know, just kind of really just focusing on what my style might be. And I took a lot from, initially, I took a lot from both my mother and my sister's styles.
Mhm.
You have to learn from somewhere. You have to grow from somewhere. So I think after that point, a couple of years in a number of galleries, I ended up really started just thinking about what is my style? What is it that I want to do? What is it that really makes me happy to continue to keep doing this? So I think that's when I really started to work on it. And I, you know, booths at Indian Market, Santa Fe Indian Market, have been for a number of years generational. So I remember being a kid and watching my mother and my grandmother in the booth, you know, and the people sitting next to us who were jewelers from Santo Domingo, right? They were the grandparents, and their children and their grandchildren were in their booth. So I bring that up. Now I lost my point.
So it's generational. So the question is it still generational at Indian Market as far as the booths go? They've changed that, I guess, right?
Yes. So when I finally, you know, I was at a point of sharing, you know, my first time sharing my mother's booth as an artist, you know, as opposed to just sitting there as a spectator or
Right.
as a young child, that I'm actually an artist myself, and I enter for the first time for judging, and ended up winning a first place ribbon. So that was a really fantastic validation of all of that struggle, you know, from the first time I received that note to that point in time.
You know, the old stuff I remember, the more contemporary stuff.
You were there for a long time.
We were there for several years, yeah. Well, until Sam took over.
Yeah, and then Sam wanted to close down the retail part and just do more.
So we had the full range of rugs and all kinds of things besides our own jewelry, and we continued our special orders stuff, and I continued my own designing and making jewelry as well as doing those ecclesiastical commissions. One thing you mentioned about aluminum was I did depart from working in silver for this one commission. Northminster Presbyterian Church, which is on the corner of Fort Lowell and Tucson Boulevard, is sort of a New England style church with a spire and things like that. But they were building a new chapel part. And the architect, Gordon Lupke, was a local architect. And they designed it with a big arch in the back of the church, and they envisioned putting something there. And Reverend Rowley had a Celtic cross cast in Scotland. It was about 8 or 10 inches tall. And they were shopping around to have something similar done to fit in that niche they had in the back, or the arch space. They didn't really know what they were going to do with it when it was designed and it was built.
And so you got that commission.
So the building committee asked the architect, Gordon Lupke, do you know they try to get people from California? The people from California did the stained glass. They said, do you know anybody in California? No, it would do something for us like this cross this small cross I have. No. So they asked Gordon, and he said, well, you have a man in Tucson who does metal work. His name is Frank Patania. And so he came in and said, would I be interested in this project? And I said, yeah, it sounds like a very interesting project. So I said, I'll make some sketches. And they said it would need to be about 6 feet tall. And I said, well, okay.
Yeah.
But I said, I better look at the location. And the arch was much too big. I said, 6 feet will look out of place. In the arch, there'll be a lot of empty space. It has to be at least 9 feet tall. Right. And he said, can you do that? And I said, well, I truly didn't know how I was going to do it. But I had met a friend, another craftsman, who introduced me to the famous lost styrofoam casting technique. You could carve a model in styrofoam, put it in a box or a form where you could pack casting sand around it. And this is a typical technique where the foundries would make a wooden form, and they would pack the casting sand around it, and they'd take the form out, and the hollow left by the form was what was cast. So there was a foundry here called the Knight Foundry that did casting for the mines. They made great big bronze valves and things like that. So at any rate, I was introduced by this friend and craftsman to styrofoam, and I made some styrofoam pieces, which I think maybe will include here for you to have to sell.
Great.
Part of my early work. But anyway, I made some cast styrofoam jewelry. It was a lot of fun. I would take a tin can, cut the bottom out of it, and I would carve a model in styrofoam mounted on a little, the base was mounted on a base, and make a spout for pouring the metal, and melt the metal in a crucible, and I would pour it in, and the red hot metal would vaporize the styrofoam, and it would occupy the space the styrofoam did. And in just a couple of minutes, you could break out the casting sand, and there is the piece cast in silver, sort of with a textured finish.
Almost like tufa casting.
Well, no, tufa, you're sort of limited to flat forms.
Right.
This you can make three-dimensional pieces.
Right.
So, and very different. No, different completely from tufa.
But the sensibility of what you got out was kind of similar?
Yeah, the piece was.
Yeah.
It was flat, but the technique was quite different.
Yeah.
So this is more freer way of expression.
Did you do tufa casting, by the way? Did you ever do tufa casting yourself? Yeah. Okay. Just making sure.
Yeah,
it's right on my wrist.
I did quite a bit of tufa casting. We'll get into that later after I finish this story if you want to go on with it. I don't know how much film you have or time.
No film, all digital.
Oh, that's right. I am still
space
not used to the new ways.
Yeah, it's battery and card space.
And if you don't like it, you just erase it and do something else. So, anyway, you didn't have to have negatives or anything. But I said this would be an interesting project. I think I can do it by casting it, by carving it, the model in the styrofoam.
Yeah.
So I went to look at the location, and it had to be 9 feet tall to be proportion. So I went to an insulation place that sold styrofoam about 6 inches thick by 12 or 14 inches or so by maybe 6 feet long. It was blue, and it carved very nicely. So what I did was I had a drawing of the cross, so I took it to Tucson Blueprint and had it blown up to full size. So I had a paper. I glued it on, I cemented it or attached it to a cardboard so it would be stiff. And, part of the story was Reverend Rowley came back with a couple of men from the building committee, and I said, I made 4 different design suggestions for you. The first one I showed him was the one that we ended up with. But he looked at it and said, no, absolutely not. So I showed them the others, which were simpler solutions to the problem, but really weren't very distinctive. And I said, Reverend, you have to come back and look at this. This design I wanted to represent something outgoing that gave, something flowed from it. And he looked at it and he said, I am the cross. He said, this vine is like the vine of on the cross. And he just got all inspired about this design. So he said, okay, let's show it to the building committee. So as I said, I had it blown up, took it to the church. The building committee were all sitting there. They looked at it and they didn't like it. But Reverend Rowley convinced them this is appropriate for what we want. It was quite contemporary, and still it expressed a thought of something being more ethereal and rather just a metal cross.
What was the metal that you used in it?
Well, I went to the foundryman, Mr. Knight of Knight Foundry, who did all that commercial work. I took the styrofoam model to him and I said, that was the one requirement. It had to be silver in color, which was their Celtic cross was. So I said, I would like to have this cast in aluminum alloy. It has to be silver metal. And he said, well, we have alloys we can use. So he said, I've never done any artwork. It's all commercial. He said, this sounds like it'd be an interesting project. So I was very grateful to Mr. Knight that he was willing to undertake this project. So the piece was so big, I made the model in different pieces. And at that time, I didn't know how I was going to join the pieces.
Right.
I got through the part of finding somebody who could do styrofoam casting for me. Right. Completely. They use all the wooden forms and stuff because they had to repeat different things all the time. So I took this one piece, the top part of the cross, to him. And I showed it to him, and he said, this is too thick. The styrofoam didn't weigh anything. If you cast this in metal, it's going to be much too heavy. You got to make it thinner. So from the inside, I didn't alter the design, but I kept hollowing it out. I took it to him a couple times. It's still too thick. It's still too thick. So when I finished it, I could hold it up to the light and see the design. It was that thin where the design would be in the metal. He said, okay, we'll try this. So he had his men pack it in the casting sand. And when they started the pour, the vaporize made so much heat and fumes, they weren't used to that. But he said they stuck with it because they knew it was an important art project. Right. And they wanted to see it complete. So it came out beautifully, except it had a finish like, it was cement colored gray. Yeah. And it was cast in fine sand, but it had a sort of a textured finish. And of course it had to be polished. So I finished the other parts and had them all cast. And I started, I spent hours grinding it down and then using finer and finer grit. I was using a polisher that had I found flap wheels that had various grits of emery. They were pieces of paper that were flaps, so it could conform to curved surfaces. So I had this electric tool. It was very heavy. Well, I spent hours and hours grinding and polishing it, but I had to get the pieces assembled. And I didn't realize aluminum. I thought I could send it with, I could do it myself with a welding torch. It wouldn't touch it. So I said, I have to find somebody to put these pieces together. So I went to an aircraft manufacturing company, and they did, yeah, we can weld these pieces together. So I took the pieces to them. I helped the technician, the welder, put it together properly and clamp it down and all of that. And he welded the pieces together. The alloy was very similar in color, but if you looked at it closely, you could see a little bit of the seams.
Yeah.
So then I took it back home and finished grinding and polishing it. And I was working on my carport on 2 sawhorses. So I was working on it flat. And as I said, I spent hours and hours grinding and polishing it. Then I had to carve a styrofoam base for it and take that to the foundry, and they cast that. And then I had to figure out how to attach that. So I tapped and drilled and was able to screw the base onto it. And the ring, the Northminster cross, has a ring around it with openings for the cross. So I cast those in separate pieces because they were much thinner, and I tapped and died and attached those 4 pieces to the back to make the ring. And I finished the project, and I told them from the beginning I couldn't be responsible for mounting it, but I can make the cross. And he said, no problem, we have a contractor who can do the work.
Right. How heavy was this thing?
It weighed 500 pounds.
Oh, Jesus.
Aluminum alloy, almost 500
Wow.
pounds.
Did you have any idea what you were getting into? When
No, I had no idea how I was going to do it, no idea how the project was going. I didn't know who was going to cast it. When I had it cast, I didn't know who was going to weld it. I had faith that I could get it done.
Yeah. And at some point, was there a point where you go,
No,
you knew you would get it done?
Yeah, I knew it was going to happen.
Yeah.
I was going to work every day. I was running my business, and I was kind of repeating the same day. It was Groundhog Day every day. And so my wife she was at the hairdresser or something. I dropped her off, and I had to pick her up in an hour or something. And so there was an art store next door. This is in West Palm Beach. And I wandered into it. It was Jerry's Artorama. And I just started looking around. I hadn't been in an art store since maybe ever. I don't know, when I was a kid or something. And so I just started buying stuff. I bought a bunch of colors, acrylic and brushes and an easel. And I probably spent $200 or $300. And so I went home and I got some photographs, and I started painting and trying to paint from the photographs. And I got real frustrated real fast because my paint was clumpy. I didn't know how to use it. And I couldn't get what was in my brain out onto the paper or the canvas. And so I worked on it for about 3 weeks, and I said, this is nonsense. I just don't have the talent. I can't do this. And so I boxed it all up. I threw it in the basement, and my wife, thankfully, was paying attention. And so for my birthday, she bought me an art lesson at the Armory Arts Center in West Palm Beach. And I go to this lesson, and the guy is an abstract painter. I didn't know that at the time. And I go in there, and he's like, he's not doing any teaching. He's just saying, just express yourself, throw the paint on canvas. And I tried it, and I just couldn't get my head into it. And I said to him, I did a couple classes, and I said to him, I'd like to learn how to paint something that's real. And I didn't even know what the terms were at the time. I said, like a bottle or a flower or something that's real. He says, oh, nobody does that anymore. And he said, he says, you'll never make it if you do that stuff. And I said, well, but I'm not trying to make a living. I just want to do it. And he says, no, you can't learn that here. He said, you can't learn it anywhere. Nobody teaches it anymore. So I left the class. I took my painting home and was discouraged. And I had a meeting in Miami, and which is about an hour and a half away. And I went down to this meeting to meet this guy, and then he said goodbye, and he dropped me at my car. Well, what I didn't realize, and this is kind of pre-cell phone, what I didn't realize is that my keys had fallen out of my pocket in the seat of his car. I had no way to reach him.
Oh, God.
And I was an hour and a half away. So I didn't think to call a locksmith. So I called a cab, and cab driver was an artist. And I told him all my history and my story about art and my frustration. And he said, well, there's a guy in West Palm Beach by the name of Jack Jackson. He said, he's in the lineage of Jerome. I said, what's that mean? He said, well, one painter studies under another who studies under another. And he said, he's the real deal. He studied in Florence. He studied with Ives Gammel. He studied with Frank Riley. He's the real deal. I didn't know these names, of course. And so he gave me the guy's number, and I waited a year because I was so intimidated. And then I went in one Saturday morning, and I sat in the car, and I was like, should I go in or should I not go in? And I get out of the car, and then I get back in the car because I was still pretty insecure, and especially about that. And so I finally went in, and my hands were sweating, and I walked in, and I vividly can remember that moment. I looked around at all the artists who were there, which were mostly, 50 plus women.
Right.
And they were doing copies of old masters. And I looked around and I thought, I can't do this. So I just turned around and I walked out. Thankfully, he happened to see me out of the corner of his eye, and he called me back in. He said, can I help you? And I told him the story. And he said, look, I can teach you this. He said, I have a system. He said, anybody can learn to paint. You don't have to have any talent. He said, you just have to learn the process. He said, if you give me 18 months, I'll have you doing work like those people up there who have been painting for a couple of years. So I went in every Saturday, and I took Wednesday afternoons off, and I went in every Wednesday, and I studied with him for a few years. And that was the life-changing moment. The epiphany moment for me was I had gone on a business trip to San Francisco, and I started going on business trips. I started going to art museums, which I never would have done before because I didn't really understand it. I didn't know anything about it. And we had been copying Bouguereau, and I walked in and I stood in front of a Bouguereau painting, and I wept. I literally cried. And the reason I wept is because I looked at, I could see the veins under the arms, and I could see the hairs on the arms, and I could see the softness of the material. And I realized after doing that for a couple of years, I realized what that man had to go through to be able to learn that, because it didn't come easy. And so at that moment in time, I made a decision that I'm going to dedicate my life to art. So when I went back, I started looking for opportunities. Well, shortly after that, I had been pitching a .com idea to a venture capital firm, and they called me out several times. Finally, they gave me a bunch of money and said, we're going to fund your company. You need to move out to San Francisco. So I moved out there, got the company started, and then my wife got pregnant with triplets, and I was painting in the back bedroom. And she said, you got to get the smell of the paint out of the house. I can't stand it. So I went into the garage, and she said, still not good enough. So she said, you might as well give up painting anyway, because you're going to be too busy being the father of triplets. I said, not an option. I have to paint. So I decided we lived on a golf course. So I said, I'll go paint outside on the golf course. So I took a card table, a chair, a studio easel, a box of paint, 5 trips out to the corner of the golf course where there was no golfing going on, and that we had a beautiful view. And I started trying to paint out there. Well, of course, it was a disaster, because painting outside is always a disaster when you first try it. My canvas kept blowing off the easel, and bugs and everything else. But that's when I first discovered plein air painting. I didn't know it was called that. And I went to a business trip in LA, and I met with a guy named Dick, a friend of mine. And I was telling him about, I I had seen a certain type of painting, but I didn't know what it was called. And he says, "Oh, that's plein air painting. Let me take over to this bookstore." So he bought me this book, Plein Air Painters of the North and Plein Air Painters of the South. And that's when I discovered what plein air really was and the old California plein air painters and so on. So I started trying to find somebody to teach me. Again, the internet is just kind of really early on. The web is really early on. And even though I'm in the internet business, I was not finding, workshops or anything else. Finally, I discovered one that Plein Air Painters of America were doing. And I went to that, studied with Matt Smith and Ken Oster and a bunch of them. So when I started seeing people at these events, I thought, I think there may be a movement here. So I thought, I'm in the magazine business anyway. I was doing the .com, I was still doing the magazine. And so I called my people up and I said, we're going to start a magazine called Plein Air. And they said, what? What's that? And so we started it. We operated it for 2 years and it was a miserable failure. We had a lot of subscribers, but we couldn't get any advertisers because the advertisers at the time, and you probably were one of the people I talked to, I don't know, but the advertisers
I advertised.
were like, we don't carry plein air paintings. We carry finished studio paintings or, and the vendors would say, well, nobody paints plein air. We're not going to ever sell any paint. And I said, this is going to be a huge movement. And nobody would believe me.
Was this like 204? Was this kind of 204 timeframe?
Yeah. So I don't know if the movement was happening or if we stimulated it. I really don't know. But both, anyway, maybe. And so I had to close down Plein Air Magazine, and I thought I can't just let go. So we switched it to Fine Art Connoisseur, and because we thought, well, maybe we won't have the same argument. Well, then there were different arguments, of course, but anyway, that's been a long time. And then after about 2 or 3 years, I said, we've got to bring back Plein Air, and so we did. This time there were more people, more subscribers, more advertisers, and so both of them have been going strong since then. I mean, we've had our rocky times, but
do you think that
that's how it all happened?
When you brought it back, plein air, do you think it's because people understood better what that meant and what, because there's all these, movements out there, lots of people painting plein air. It's just a bigger thing. People know what it is. Do you think that's it? Or was it actually the business model was changed? You did something with the magazine that changed it?
Well, I think it was a little bit of both. There was definitely, there were not really any plein air events going on at the time, maybe 3 or 4. And, there started a few events as we were about ready to wind down. When we relaunched it, I remember having a discussion with my team, a small team. And I said, first off, my bookkeeper said, don't do it. This is going to bankrupt you. It's expensive to do this. And I said, no, it'll work. And this time. And so she was like, nah, I recommend against it. Anyway, everybody was kind of against me on it. But I said, this time we're going to launch a convention. And what I didn't realize is that it's really hard to make a living with a magazine by itself. Now, I should know that because I'm in the magazine business, but our other magazine, the radio magazine, had a conference with it. And the conference is what really brought us our cash flow. So, because advertising and subscribers are tough. And so it was launching the convention and getting people together, kind of like a Thanksgiving for artists, that I think made the big difference. And then bringing in artists so that they could learn and grow. And so that thing started out at, I think it was 300 or 400 people. And, it's up to, the last one was 1,000 people.